take full responsibility for the fact that in the face of Brexit and the threats that a disorganised Brexit could do, we took the resources were moved across the department to focus on that threat, including away from pandemic preparedness planning.
Now, I don't know about you, Annabel. I don't know what he's talking about, and I don't know what he means. And I listen to that sort of word salad, as some people would describe it, and go, well, what planning did you have in place for a Brexit that might go wrong, which you moved to a pandemic which did go wrong, and then what have you got to say for yourself? They don't seem to be asking the right questions here.
I think that's a real problem with the COVID inquiries, that it's just becoming sort of a group therapy exercise for those who may have very sadly lost family members to the coronavirus, but also an opportunity for left-wing shibboleths to be peddled, but surprisingly by some supposedly right-wing politicians. Yes, I think Matt Hancock's overall point was that Britain needs to prepare for wider, earlier and more stringent lockdowns. He very much still subscribes to the lockdown dogma, that we failed to implement lockdown soon enough, that we failed to implement those really stringent controls on people's liberties sharply and quickly enough. And I find that, absolutely extraordinary. He's also repeated the concerns that we were planning for an influenza pandemic, but had we known that a coronavirus pandemic was around the corner, then of course lockdown would have been on the table. It surprised him to discover that it wasn't. And I think that we're forgetting that lockdown is first a very blunt policy tool that, as it turns out, may not have been necessary. Second, it was a policy tool that came with all sorts of consequences in terms of the economic and the social costs that simply were not considered. But third, there's a reason why it wasn't contemplated by governments before 2020, and that was because nobody believed that a government would impose this on its people. It was not until Beijing imposed a lockdown in China, and then Italy did it after that massive surge in cases and deaths in Lombardy, that it struck our scientific advisors, that it struck our politicians, that this might be something that they could implement in order to tackle the coronavirus. And like I said at the start, my concern is just that we're not going to be asking the right questions here. We're not going to be asking why it was that lockdowns went on for so long. The initial idea was that we would squash the sombrero for 3 weeks while that first lockdown went on for months. Yeah. What was the purpose of the second lockdown? And had the vaccine not come along, how long would we have had these rolling lockdowns for, where we were trapped in our homes for a period of time? Perhaps we had tier systems up and down the country, all of these sorts of questions. I don't think that we're going to have answered in the inquiry. And what that means is, perhaps Matt Hancock would be in favour of this, but is that lockdowns are going to be much more likely in future. We just simply won't have the same level of hesitation as we did in 2020.
No, and they're clinging on to this narrative that the lockdown actually was a good thing, when there's so much evidence that it wasn't a good thing and that it really didn't prevent the deaths that would have happened probably anyway. Whether it had happened earlier or whether the lockdown was stronger or for longer, it wouldn't have made any difference, because by and large the people who did die would have died whether there was a lockdown or not, probably.
I think that's probably right. I think we also should bear in mind, Matt Hancock is obviously saying this amid mounting evidence that lockdown caused more harm than the disease. Look in recent weeks at the increase in the number of child mental health referrals. Look at the massive increase in eating disorders, particularly among young girls. Concerns have been raised that there's a cancer bomb that is ticking. These are people who simply could not get access to treatment, still can't get access to treatment, whose cancer diagnoses are going to be getting worse and worse as time goes on, and none of these things seem to be considered. Matt Hancock and the medical elite's assumptions seem to be that all lockdown was designed to do was to try and prevent as many COVID deaths as possible. And it didn't matter what the other health or social or economic consequences of it might be, and we're now discovering that they're absolutely enormous. I mean, look at the backlog on the NHS. Over 7 million people who are currently waiting to get treatment. These people who, if they are not seen soon, could potentially die of illnesses that should have been treatable. These are really serious issues. And of course, wrapped into all of that, you've got our stubbornness about NHS reform, the fact that that is just impossible at the moment, even though our healthcare services really been shown to be completely lacking. Why is it that we're not looking at healthcare services on the continent where you have social insurance systems that are providing better outcomes, much better performance, better survival rates, whereas when it comes to Britain, I think we top the table when it comes to treatable mortality. This is really shocking stuff, and the question, I think, is how much longer are the public going to stand for it? Are we going to turn against the NHS, and will that finally allow some root and branch reforms to be implemented?
Well, that's a very good question, a very good point. We've been talking about that today as well. Annabel, thank you very much indeed. Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor at The Telegraph.